Welcome back to the second hour of Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor. Well, I'm really pleased to have with me again, I believe for the third time, Dimitri Orlov. Dimitri was born and grew up in Leningrad, but has lived in the United States since the mid-70s. He was an eyewitness to the Soviet collapse over several extended visits to his Russian homeland between the late 80s and mid-90s. He is an engineer who has contributed to the fields as diverse as high-energy physics and internet security, as well as a leading peak oil theorist. He is the author of Reinventing Collapse, the Soviet Example and American Prospects. Welcome, Dimitri, to Turning Hard Times into Good Times.
Great to be on your show, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
Really good to have you back, and I failed to mention that you do have a new book coming out, and that is The 5 Stages of Collapse, and that is, I think, what I want us to talk about most today. But in your previous book that we talked to you about before, Reinventing Collapse, you talked about the cycles. You talked a little bit about the topic of the book we want to talk to you today about, but we also talked about the pattern of the collapse in the former Soviet Union. If you could possibly just summarize for our listeners, those that didn't hear previous interviews, what was behind the cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, I was probably the first to mention it, but now just about everybody else is jumping on the same bandwagon, basically saying that the United States is following the course of the collapse of the USSR. I realized that pretty early on, in 1996 or so, after several extended visits back there, during which I observed the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. But what really caused it was energy supply shortages. The Soviet Union, the oil production there peaked 2 or 3 years before it collapsed, and that caused a phenomenal amount of economic and financial dislocation. Interestingly, conventional oil production in the world peaked in 2005, which is, again, 3 years before the financial collapse of 2008. So there's a very strong parallel there. Another very strong parallel is militarism and a messianic drive to install pliable, obedient democracies around the world. The Soviet Union was trying to do that with respect to many places around the world. And the United States took over the mantle after the USSR collapsed and became possessed by the strange neoconservative messianic zeal. There was a string of orange revolutions, and there were invasions of several countries and attempts to install democracies there. All of them failures, every single one. The last orange revolution right now has finally run its course in the former Soviet Georgia, where the hand-picked president of the country, Michael Saakashvili, is now becoming a persona non grata in his own country. And all of the other orange revolutions are likewise a complete mess. Another parallel that is really worth making is that the Soviet Union, by the end, was governed by this ridiculously corrupt, entrenched plutocratic elite, completely incapable of reform, not willing to accept that the times are changing, and that changes have to be made, and they basically morphed into a criminal class after a certain amount of time. And exactly the same thing is happening in the United States as we speak.
Very interesting. I have to ask you though, Dimitri, since we last talked, maybe it's been a year and a half, 2 years ago, fracking has come into play in the United States. Now I know that that energy and the cost of energy and peak oil is a very big part of your thesis, but to what extent, if any, can the fracking revolution delay the problems you're talking about in the United States?
Well, I think that fracking is mainly just a way to siphon money out of the system. There really is a great deal of desperation because, we still have lots and lots of people who believe that, there should be, 7% yield on things, even if the economy isn't growing. So they're getting desperate and they're willing to throw things at all sorts of ventures, and fracking is one of them. Fracking is a way to generate a sizable amount of natural gas for a short period of time at the cost of a whole lot of environmental devastation. And the way they've gone about the whole thing is basically spent money on drilling, and the resulting gas was sold at a loss. And the funny thing is that now they don't even have that much gas left to sell. They've vented a lot of it, and they've pretty much just lost a lot of it, and the rest they sold at a loss. So it's pretty much run its course at this point, I would think, and I don't think that it's going to be a very significant contribution overall. But the background to that, the fracked wells, they deplete very, very fast. Mm-hmm. But the background to that is that conventional gas production is dropping like a rock, mm-hmm. and it's not coming back up. Mm-hmm. So once fracking is done, we're back to having a nightmare scenario as far as natural gas is concerned.
Oh. Interesting. Another point I have to bring up, and I have to ask you about, because as one who hasn't lived in both countries, I've been thoroughly indoctrinated by the propaganda of my country to believe that the Soviet Union would not have been a country that was trying to export democracy or create democracies, but if anything, totalitarian governments overseas, totally dependent on Moscow. So how do you answer that?
Well, one person's totalitarianism is another person's democracy. It depends on, how you twist that thing and,
Yeah.
in the light. The United States doesn't really export democracy. It installs pliant dictators, or tries to, around mm-hmm. the world. Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union pretty much did the same. Mm-hmm. The sort of democracy that they both espouse is supposedly representative democracy, but the representatives also tend to be handpicked and part of an elite. And so this is not the sort of democracy that you might have in an old place like Iceland or like Switzerland or like the Isle of Man. Places mm-hmm. that have been democratic for 1,000 years that very quickly revert to direct democracy mm-hmm. when their representatives turn out to no longer represent them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to know we had Dr. Peter Treadway on this show 2 or 3 weeks back, and he was talking about the American Constitution didn't have the word democracy in it once. It was to have been a representative republic, and of course it was Wilson who said we have to make the world safe for democracy. That's when that first started coming in, that's why we had to give up our lives in foreign wars, was to make the world a better place for democracy. And so there was that propaganda. At the same time, of course, the Federal Reserve and some elite banking families started to gain a lot more influence probably in the process. But I would agree with you. I was only raising the question because as one indoctrinated in the United States, I certainly didn't believe that the Soviets were going to care about democracy like we, good people here in the United States, would. But anyway, I totally agree with what you're saying on that point. Now, the Soviet collapse, how did the people manage to survive there? Because they have survived. And then I want to ask you, what is life like, to the extent you can talk about it now, in the Soviet Union years after the collapse?
Well, starting from the end, Russia has become a fairly conservative place that is really interested in stability and economic growth, and it's getting a lot more prosperous mm-hmm. and richer, mm-hmm. and so people are very interested in stability and economic development, in improving governance. In that it was a lawless place during the 90s. It is no longer a lawless place, and now they're reeling in the last remnants of that lawlessness, which is all of the the money laundering and the foreign tax shelters and free movement of capital that leads to a great deal of crime and corruption, and reeling in the gray economy that still exists there. So it's becoming a fairly tightly governed, very conservative, professionally run place that really isn't interested in any kind of ideology at all. Their ideology is all very practical. There's nothing like the neocons in the United States, which have, dreams of world domination. Mm-hmm. Nothing like that in Russia at all. But interesting.
You go ahead, yeah.
But what allowed, the former Soviet citizens to survive the transition was the fact that the Soviet living arrangement, mostly because of all of its numerous flaws, was paradoxically resilient in the name of collapse. So socialized medicine continued to function. The distribution scheme that was at the heart of the entire agricultural system continued to function. Mm-hmm. People didn't own the roof over their heads. it was owned by the government was provided to them free of charge, more or less. So there was no homelessness, and communal services continued to be provided because that was considered one of the key government functions that, whoever was in charge was basically willing to do anything possible to perpetuate. And overall, there was a level of stability because it wasn't a market economy, a level of stability built into the living arrangement that basically allowed it to function at some level, even as this new kind of free enterprise way of doing things took form. Mm-hmm. Now, in the United States, there's nothing like that. It's all, everybody here is just absolutely abjectly dependent on finance and commerce and all of the functioning thereof. And other parts of the living arrangement, like the complete dependence on the private automobile, also mean that once gasoline is no longer accessible, people can't even get home. The suburbia just basically disappears because you can't walk out of there. Mm-hmm. And so compared to the post-Soviet living arrangement, the post-American living arrangement is barely survivable for a great many people.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is you think that we're not as well prepared for the ultimate collapse or the collapse of the Soviets. The Soviets certainly did suffer through a lot of, the people of the Soviet Union certainly did suffer through a lot of pain and difficulty, though, during that transition, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Yes, there was a spike in mortality. A lot of people lost their way. There was a lost generation of same thing as that's happening here now is, a lot of graduates couldn't find work. And 10 years later, they were unemployable and lost their way in the world, a lot of them. So the social dislocation that happened there is similar to what's happening here now with the long-term unemployed and the people who can't find work after graduation, et cetera. But I think it's going to get worse here. It certainly did get worse there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'd like to talk to you then about the 5 stages of collapse. And if you could just perhaps, if we can run through them and then tell us where you think that we are now in the United States, for example. Before we get to that, I was just reading somebody, a fund manager out of Switzerland, who is very looking at the Western world. In fact, I think Europe as well as the United States. I don't think he would include the BRIC countries by any means, but and he's really worried, given what's going on in Cyprus and the likelihood that it's going to spread. In his view, that we could be staring at something much more serious than what you were talking about in the Soviet Union. His fear is that we could be looking at some sort of a major cycle, like a 300-year cycle, a dark age, or even a 2,000-year cycle. Do you see anything that cataclysmic on the horizon for the Western world?
Yes, I see the end of industrial civilization rapidly approaching.
Wow.
And it's going to be a global phenomenon, but it'll hit different countries at different times. For instance, Russia has 70 years of natural gas left at current rate of consumption. Mm-hmm. The United States does not. So there are big differences like that, and natural gas is a landlocked commodity in spite of the liquefied natural gas trade, but that's really a boutique trade in terms of volume. So there are big differences like that, but overall, the period of rapid economic growth and population growth is over. It's done. It's never going to come back. So this is not a cycle. This is a pulse, because this planet had a certain endowment of fossil fuels, and we've burned through half of it already, or a little more than half of it, and the rest of it is really dregs. It's not going to be energy effective to get the rest of it out. You can't sustain an economy on what's left. So that's what we're looking at, is the end of this pulse of human development on Earth.
And industrial civilization as we've known it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the 5 stages. Stage 1, the financial collapse. Where are we? Is that where we are now in the United States? And perhaps you can compare what we're going through in each case with what the Soviet Union went through.
Well, I came up with the 5 stages in February of 2008, just as financial collapse became an actual term that people would use to describe what's happening. And the stages that I defined are financial collapse, commercial collapse, political collapse, social collapse, and cultural collapse. And so financial collapse, these are all predicated on various levels of faith in the status quo that are breached at various times. So financial collapse occurs when risk cannot be estimated or controlled because the faith in the future goes missing. People no longer think that the future will resemble the past, and therefore the bets that they've made are not going to pay off. Commercial collapse is when people lose faith in the free market system, the idea that you can actually use your money to buy what you need to live. And that hasn't really happened to a great deal yet, except in places that have really actually collapsed, like Greece, where you can't buy the drugs you need to live in the pharmacy because the country no longer imports them, because the country is out of money. And political collapse, we've seen hints of it already in places like Greece and in Italy, where elected representatives are being replaced with political appointees vetted by the country's creditors. But as it runs its course, government loses all legitimacy and all power because the tax base shrinks, because commercial collapse causes incomes to dwindle to next to nothing. And commercial collapse is caused by financial collapse because the banks can no longer lend, so imports dry up because nobody can grant or honor letters of credit. Very simple mechanisms suddenly fail to materialize. So once those first three stages run their course, then the fallback is basically something very local, the local society as it exists, which can perpetuate itself through charity or through various informal barter and gift-based arrangements, maybe a little bit of trade based on some trade goods that are left over, but nobody really has any money or money that's worth anything. They might have bundles of worthless cash, but people somehow have to deal with each other one-on-one because their transactions are no longer mediated by the government or by the market or by financial institutions. They have to make it up as they go along. And if that fails, then the final point is how families hold together, how very small groups of people function. And if they don't function, then that is cultural collapse. And at that point, humans stop resembling humans. And I've actually studied some tribes that went through all 5 stages. And in my book, I detail what that looks like, and it's not pretty.
So how far did the Soviet Union go in these stages? They didn't get to stage 5.
Oh no, there was
stage 3 at least.
It went to stage 3 and then it bounced back. So basically, I would say that financial collapse kind of ran its course by the late 90s. There was a default in Russia, but then what came afterward was actually better and more stable. Commercial collapse, well, that sorted itself out in a very messy way through mafia-dominated markets during the 1990s, the lawless 90s. And it's certainly not a good way to introduce a free market system. Nobody in their right mind would propose something like that ever again, even though at the beginning of it, Western economists were all in favor of it. I hope that they've learned their lesson. I don't know if they're capable of learning anything, but if they are, they should have learned their lesson from that. And as far as political collapse, well, the Yeltsin government was very weak, but then when Putin came back, he very quickly put his house in order. And the Russian state bounced back with a great deal of vigor since then. And Russia is on its way to becoming a law-abiding society.
Interesting. So do you think that we might be poised for something further down the chain? I mean, beyond stage 3? I mean, if I hear what you're saying, the end of the industrial age would suggest that maybe the Soviets have gotten off fairly easily then.
Well, the really troublesome thing is that in the United States, social and cultural collapse have already, to a large extent, run their course. So one indicator is, for instance, the majority of children in the United States is born out of wedlock because families here are that weak. And families, as in, nuclear families are basically a luxury that some people can afford and others cannot. And as far as extended families, at this point, functioning extended families, which actually where a lot of economic activity happens within the family,
Yeah.
is a real rarity confined to certain ethnic groups such as the Koreans, the Vietnamese, some Hispanics, people who come from traditional cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So it's becoming an extreme rarity. But that is really the bedrock, the foundation of a healthy society, is an extended family where most economic relationships are within the family itself. Things like childcare are not outsourced outside the family.
Yes, yes. And what you're saying is that, and I agree with you that it's largely gone to a great extent, although I would say that in the Midwest, from where I come from, some of the more conservative areas, there still are extended families, though they're becoming more rare. Are you saying that in the Soviet Union, you never really had that much of a problem with the demise of the families and the extended families?
Well, in Russia, the typical living arrangement was 3 generations under one roof.
Wow. That certainly is more economic, isn't it? It may not be the most pleasant environment, but it would be more economic.
Yes. Well, see, the other thing is that Russia is really a historical country with a somewhat painful but nevertheless a shared historical experience that binds people together.
Mm-hmm.
And makes people very strongly attached to a certain vision of themselves that nobody controls. Not the government, nobody. It's really just very ingrained in the way people think. Mm-hmm. Whereas the United States is not cohesive on an ethnic level or a cultural level.
Correct.
And being an American is a question of buying into a business plan.
Oh.
Okay, so what happens if that business plan fails?
Mm-hmm.
Do you still have a country?
Yeah. Good point. So as I understand it, Dimitri, that these stages might not necessarily come in order. If I'm hearing you right, stage 4, the social collapse, is already to a great extent is in process in the United States. We haven't seen a real political collapse yet, although arguably it's very close. You see the Republicans and Democrats fighting tooth and nail over issues of ideology, and so I guess there's that. The system hasn't really collapsed yet, though, has it?
Oh, no. Well, see, political collapse is a funny animal because politicians, more than anyone else, have the ability to pretend that things are okay for a really long time. So what you actually have to watch is the point in time when they can no longer spend money. Mm-hmm. When that fails, that's the key ingredient that tells you that it doesn't matter whether they're still running their mouths in front of the camera.
Right. But they won't have the ability to run their mouths in front of the camera when they run out of money even. So I guess here's the issue. The U.S. is able still to print money and use it to a great extent around the world as a world's reserve currency. How long do you think that's going to go on?
Well, with all of these things, nobody knows how long they go on, but the only thing that's known is that it's a confidence game.
Yeah.
And when it fails overnight. It fails instantaneously. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that is indicative that we may not be very far from it failing is that, this new way of bailing out banks by not insuring deposits is a very interesting plan. So you used to be able to do cash transactions. Now, those have been outlawed in most places. Then you used to put money in a bank and it would be insured up to a certain number. Well, now it's not so much insurance. It's like you get this worthless bank stock, right? Mm-hmm. And that's after the hedge funds get paid off.
Yeah. Yep.
And because they come first. In a bankruptcy, the hedge funds get paid off first. I don't know who came up with that wonderful scheme.
Yeah.
But now putting your money in a bank is a good way of losing it because it's just unsecured debt. You're just lending money to an insolvent institution. So what's left? What does money mean if you can't keep it in cash and you can't keep it in a bank? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? Nobody knows. Okay, so nobody wants to think about it, but the moment they do, they suddenly realize that, well, we need to kind of redefine what money is. And I talk about that in my book a lot. I spent a long time thinking about it, and it's interesting that Cyprus came along just as my book is going to press, because, I wrote about that exact thing, is what do you do when money becomes onerous, unreliable, and borderline impossible to work with? Mm-hmm. How do you still keep an economy going? And there are ways, but they're very different from what we're used to.
All right. Can you offer a couple of ideas there in that regard?
Yes, it all has to be based on personal trading relationships and personal trust.
Uh-huh.
And it's not a question of numbers on a piece of paper. It's not a question of piles of gold bullion either. Mm-hmm. It's a question of pledging valuable assets to a common trading scheme. Mm-hmm. And that can only be done by small groups of people who know each other. So the first thing that goes when the financial institutions go is trust.
Right.
Nobody wants to deal with each other because of counterparty risk.
Right.
Suddenly, nobody wants to deal with strangers. But the problem is, a lot of people, the only people they know are really just strangers. You know, they're all used to competing with each other. They're not used to cooperating and trusting each other. So the first thing that people have to understand is that, you know, job one is building personal trust.
Yeah. Well, that certainly makes a lot of sense. And I guess this is part of the collapse issue, though, is that the decentralization of government, the breaking down of society into smaller units, going back to a family type of a situation for survival. Is that what you see happening?
Yes. Well, the standard pattern, you know, is family as a macrocosm, or society as a macrocosm of family. So you have extended families, and you know they're governed by or self-governed by elders, and then one level up you have a council of elders, and then maybe you have some sort of a royalty, an honorary royalty, but that's like a super father. You know, you have your father, and then you have a sort of father of the entire group, of the entire tribe. So on some level, this has been really like genetically engineered into us over eons. Is, you know, that's where monarchy comes from. Monarchy is family at a slightly higher level. But it's supposed to work on a fairly low level. We're not supposed to have gigantic monarchies like the Russian Empire.
And like the British Empire and like the Anglo-American Empire now, which is obviously so far detached, and the inefficiencies of the economic inefficiencies, it seems to me, are very, very great. And I know when we talked the last time, your feeling was that we are inevitably heading back for decentralization as things break down and local governments. I guess that's the direction you see the U.S. taking, no doubt, as things sort of unfold here.
Yes, well, if you look at the United States, it's really a country that is dependent on the interstate highway system and a flood of diesel that keeps it running, and that's going to dwindle. And the maintenance costs of the interstate highway system are going to become onerous. Already, there are lots of bridges that are in disrepair, and no money to fix them. And then beyond that, the country is really bound together by the railroads, which have been completely ignored for several generations now. Again, there's no money to bring them back. And the Panama Canal. And if you knock all those three things out, then you're left with two coasts and then a sort of big parched desert-like area that's spreading in the middle, where they used to grow food, but now they can't. So that's what the U.S. in the future looks like, is two coasts and a gigantic wasteland in the middle.
Something like in geological times, it was a vast ocean of very shallow ocean, I think, and if I remember my geological history. But maybe that's what we're destined for. But you know, Dimitri, your book, and I want to tell our listeners again, The 5 Stages of Collapse. People need to go to Club Orlov, CLUBORLOV. For Dimitri's, well, it's his blog and also to buy his various products. But the 5 Stages of Collapse is a new book. It's coming out. How soon will it be? It's in May, next, just about a month away. Is that right, Dimitri?
Yes, we had the initial off-press date May 1st, and it actually might get moved to sometime in April because it's being printed right now.
Okay, and people can go in there and order this book now, and then I guess have it mailed to you, or is it available electronically as well?
It will be available electronically eventually, probably sometime in June. The paper version will actually come first this time around, interestingly enough. And yes, if you order it, I will mail it.
And the important thing to point out here, Dimitri, is you've talked, we're talking about some very sobering ideas. that I think are very much in touch with reality, and we see it unfolding, and if anything, it's more real now than it was when I first talked to you. But what I'd like to get across to my listeners also is that the 5 stages of collapse have some ideas in it about how you can survive and how you can, maybe in some ways live a richer life, a more meaningful life. We had recently Chris Martenson on our show. Hope to have him back again. He's written a book called The Crash Course, and he's talked about how downsizing and moving and not living so extravagantly but living more simply has enriched his life and his relationship with other people. I guess that's probably a theme you would agree with?
Absolutely. What I tried to do in this book is present not only just a general information on a number of collapse-related topics, but also present case studies. Each stage of collapse is accompanied by a comprehensive case study of a society that is either immune to that stage of collapse or survived that stage of collapse to show how that's done. So there are very specific adaptations that I present, and there's nothing better than an actual example to guide you, and I present a lot of examples.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. Dimitri, thank you very much for coming on the show again. It is really, I think, a very necessary topic. People should do themselves and their families a favor by following Dimitri's work and ordering the 5 stages of collapse. Thank you very much, Dimitri, for being with us.
Thank you, Jay.
Folks,
always a pleasure.
Likewise. We'll have you again sometime soon, I hope.